First of all, our philosophy is still the same. We help the Ukrainians to resist, but we don't want to escalate the war. And under no circumstances are we at war with Russia and its people.
In concrete terms, what are you going to give the Ukrainians?
We're going to launch a new cooperation and announce the sale of Mirage 2005 French combat aircraft, which will enable Ukraine to protect its soil, its airspace. And so as of tomorrow, we're going to launch a pilot training program and the handover of these aircraft, which will make it possible by the end of the year. So France is going to speak for itself tomorrow. But above all, we're in the process of building a coalition with other partners. So I won't be definitive this evening on the number.
And to give you an idea...
But the aim is that as our partners are doing on the FCs, we should be able to do it. We're going to propose to President Zelensky that the pilots can be trained as early as this summer. It normally takes 5 or 6 months, so that by the end of the year, we'll have pilots and planes.
To train in France. France or Ukraine, all Ukrainian pilots will be trained in France. There won't be any French trainers in Ukraine.
To come back to the question of training, if you like, that's a separate issue. But yes, the second thing is that we also want to train a brigade. Ukraine's challenge is that it has mobilized, we've talked about it a lot, you've talked about it in your antennas, and is in the process of mobilizing several tens of thousands of men to go to the front. The challenge is obviously to train and equip them. What we're proposing is to train 400-500 Ukrainian soldiers, to equip and train them, and then to provide them with the ammunition and weapons they need to defend their soil. And this French brigade, if I may say so, is a very important factor. We've already done a great deal with our German, Polish and other partners in training since the start of the conflict, and now we're moving on to a new stage, and we're saying here a brigade, so 4,500 men. We're going to...
There be any French trainers on Ukrainian
soil. So that's another question, which is a change in nature, which we debated last February, when you remember I had, and since then the situation has changed, welcomed. And so I think there should be no taboos on this subject. Ukrainian soil is sovereign. It's not a question of going to train in the combat zone. But when Ukraine is faced with a challenge, we must respond as we have done every time.
The defendants have heard you?
I'm just explaining the situation so that it's clear to our compatriots, because otherwise we always get attached, and somewhere along the line... I'm sorry, but you all fall into Putin's trap of pointing to a place and scaring people. And everyone says, did they or didn't they react to that? You have to know what makes sense first.
They even tell us the targets, the trainers, that's another thing.
But what's the meaning, you ask first? What does it mean to the Ukrainians? As I said, they're training thousands of soldiers. It's clear that when they had a few hundred, or when it was slower, we could go and train them, which we did in France, Germany, Poland, or elsewhere. Now there's a capability challenge. We have to move much faster because the mass is greater, and that's why 48 hours ago in an official letter saying we need you to help us train faster and we need you to come and do it on our soil. So that means there's a demand. Every time there's a request, we look at it because we want to help. The second thing we have to ask ourselves is whether this is something that's a factor in escalation. The answer is no. Going to train someone in the Western zone, which is a free zone in Ukraine, is not aggressive.
It's just an escalation factor. If they get killed, they're targeted and killed.
But why do you want it to be an escalation factor in itself? Today we have compatriots in Ukraine who are not soldiers, but civilians.
But you're telling us that if the trainers are targeted because they're trainers, as the Russians say today?
Do you think that it's less serious to have a civilian, French, German, British civilian killed in Ukraine than a soldier? Symbolically, it's very different. I don't say symbolically because it's also the role of these soldiers to get involved. So we have a strange approach. All I'm saying is that the question of training in Ukraine today is being asked by the Ukrainians. The second thing is that it is not in itself a factor for escalation. The third thing is that we are working with all our partners. And it is on the basis of a collective decision that we then join forces.
You say that it's not a factor of escalation, but if we add things up, in other words, you've authorized the use of French weapons to shoot at people in the region.
And you'll have noticed that all the allies did the same.
Men, exactly. But on top of that, you add this possible training on the ground.
Several allies are considering it. I didn't say that you have trainers on the ground in France today. We're not going to do it now. Nor are we going to do it tomorrow. What I'm saying is, why should we exclude it? because it stays in our axis. In other words, we're protecting it. And I invite you to take a look at what's happened over the past 2 years or so.
You announced the new gizmos.
Yes,
but that's not what I announced.
It's the planes. Yes, but that's not it.
Will they be able to aim at targets on Russian soil? These Mirages, which by hypothesis would be on Russian territory,
Perhaps they can
they aim at targets?
I'm going to give a very precise answer to this question, which I already answered a few days ago in Germany, next to the Chancellor. It's always the same thing. We stand by the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and we don't want any escalation. So right from the start, we've been giving them weapons to reach them. For months, the Russians were attacking on the front line. There was no question of that. Then they shifted equipment deeper into Ukraine. That's when you saw the British, the Americans, and the French sending missiles to reach these points, which had a longer range. Some others didn't make this choice, couldn't for political reasons, but we did. Now the Russians are doing something else, especially on the northern part of the front, from Belgorod and other points. They're attacking from Russian soil. If we say to the Ukrainians, you can't neutralize these Russian capabilities, i.e. the weapons the Russians are using to attack you, then we're saying you can't defend yourselves, because that means that every day they can withstand a rain of missiles and bombs that kills, that destroys. And so we say we don't allow you to use our weapons to attack civilians, to hit this or that point in Russia, but to neutralize the points from which you were attacked.
President Biden just today in an interview said, not 300 kilometers inside Russian territory. Have you set a limit yourself? 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers.
The limit is set by what the Russians do. We've never been into escalation, but we need to put things in the right order in our approach. We didn't attack Ukraine. We are not the ones who are now deciding to change the method and attack Ukraine from Russian soil.
It's been 80 years since France bombed Russia from another country.
I didn't say we're going to bomb ourselves because we're not going to send pilots, aircraft trained on the ground. But today you have munitions, equipment since the beginning of the war, French, German, English, American. And if they didn't exist today, we'd be here to lament the fact that Ukraine has surrendered.